Hello to everyone and welcome to the 6th Delphi Economic Forum. I'm very honored to be here with distinguished guests to discuss a subject that is close to my heart, lessons learned from the economic crisis. Our panel will be very interesting and lively today since all of our participants have personal experience of the Greek crisis. There are 2 out of the 10 finance ministers during the bailout years. In 2 different moments. One at the beginning, Mr. George Papakostantinu, who is now chair of the School of Transnational Governance in the European University Institute, and the other in the midst of the crisis, Γκίκα Χαρδούβελη, who is now a senior independent director in the National Bank of Greece. Also joining us from Madrid is Hoakín Almούνια, who was not only the Commissioner for Economic Affairs at the very beginning of the crisis, but recently was appointed as an independent evaluator by the ESM, Board of Governors, to conduct a review of the whole bailout design with a focus on Greece, and now is a chairman of the board in the Center for European Policy Studies. I would like to ask all of our participants to feel free to answer to each other and make comments so we could have a lively discussion. And I give the floor first to Mr. Almούνια, who has great takes from his independent evaluation of the program. So, Mr. Almούνια, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, in a very, very few minutes, I have to synthesize what are my feelings and my evaluation of the Greek crisis. So it's not easy. So I think the first decisions at the beginning of the financial crisis, both in Athens and in Brussels, were not the right ones. We were not prepared to cope with such a big crisis with profound implications. And the first country who suffered the consequences of these bad preparations and improvisations was Greece, of course. The beginning of the adjustments were very tough, extremely tough, unfair. And during the period I evaluated for the ESM, the second program and the third program, things were improving from the point of view of the design of the programs, but were not fully correct. I think the programs lacked a strategic vision, a correct diagnosis of the real roots of the crisis, and lacked also time to develop the adequate reforms, combining adjustments, reforms, and social compensation for the sufferance of the citizens that were terrible at that time. Now, the situation at the end of the programs, as the evaluation I carried out shows, was better indeed. Financial stability had improved, access to the markets improved, the fiscal position of Greece has improved, and some of the reforms that were needed were implemented, but not all the reforms. There is a lot of work to be done in the coming years. Without programs, without tough troikas visiting Athens, with more ownership, with more conviction, both from the side of the Greek authorities and the Greek society, that is of the essence, but also better understanding from the other side of the equation, the EU institutions, the ESM, that needs to better understand how the reforms needs to be developed, implemented, what is the path of the reforms that can be sustainable, and what are the messages and the social decisions to be adopted for people to get convinced that the authorities, both in Athens and in Brussels, are doing the right things. This is my very short and quick evaluation of what has happened since 2010 till now.
Yeah, but very much to the point. Thank you for that. You mentioned that Greece, that the EU was not prepared for the first program. And I want to ask Mr. Papakostantinu, you were the minister at that moment. Did you feel that way, that you were negotiating a program with partners that they were definitely not prepared? And how different is that situation that you faced then in 2010 with what Europe did now in the past year in order to give solutions for the pandemic and the economic crisis that would occur from that?
Thank you very much. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Let me first make a comment on what Joaquin just said, because I think it's very important that we go back and look at what happened, and with a dispassionate eye, as a number of institutions have done, the ESM has done, the IMF have done, to look and see what went right and what went wrong. And I have to say that the evaluations that are done pretty much come to the same results. They're not very different. They talk about problems in design, they talk about problems in implementation, they talk about a structure that was not quite adequate to the task. At the same time, I think it's important to understand that this is the ex post analysis. In other words, that this does not justify to come back and say, well, you know, look at the ex post analysis, therefore you should have handled things differently. Decisions are taken in particular moments, given the economic and political realities of the moment. And the economic and political realities in Europe, and therefore this is how I'm coming to your question, Eleni, were very, very difficult for Greece. Our partners had absolutely zero confidence in successive Greek governments. Our credibility was at zero because of the statistical fraud. And at the same time, the politics of the situation was such that the creditor countries were simply not willing to engage into the type of analysis that was necessary for a program that would give you an optimal fiscal path. In other words, enough money to be able to allow Greece to come back to markets without excessive austerity. So that's the environment that we faced at the time. And it is an environment that was, you know, was suboptimal to say the least. It's an environment that led to decisions which were harsher than they could have been otherwise. But it was what it was. And when you are the country in trouble, you are basically faced with the constraints of your creditors. And you have a choice. You either adapt to those constraints and then hope to change them along the way, as happened, or you go to a disorderly default, which is infinitely worse in terms of the kind of economic and social pain to the Greek people.
Mm-hmm. And compared to how you see the reaction of the European Union, of the Eurozone today on the crisis of the pandemic and the results on the economy compared to 2010, what would be your take shortly, if you can describe?
I think we've all learned, and it would be. I hope that we'll have the opportunity to discuss the different policy measures back then and now. But first, it's a different crisis. The moral hazard element is not there today. Nobody can claim that countries are in trouble because they did certain things wrong. So it is not a crisis which was due to policy mistakes, as was the Eurozone crisis. So that allows the so-called creditor countries, the countries that are traditionally much more difficult, let's say, going into this kind of discussions, to have a very different attitude. Look at Germany. Germany has done a 180-degree turn and supported the kind of policy measures that were unthinkable 10 years ago. So different crisis, different nature of the crisis. But also, I think that collectively, the lessons of the excessive austerity and the excessive focus on fiscal issues to the detriment of other issues, such as, for example, the banking union, that were evident in the beginning of the Eurozone crisis, have helped policymakers make better decisions now and come up with a better policy response.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Chardovelis, I want to ask you, you were a Minister of Finance during the second program of Greece, and I was wondering if you had felt that politics in member states got into the way with many decisions regarding the Greek economy, vis-a-vis the debt relief, for example, that was supposed to be given to Greece at some point during your tenure, but never happened. Did you feel that way, that politics played a more important role than actual recovery of the country?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I agree with the previous speakers. Politics was the essence. And in fact, because I was involved early on in 2012 in the Papadimos government in the PSI times and the second program. I remember that we were facing across the table not the troika, not three groups of agents, not three institutions, but four, actually. The European Commission did not yet have a voice, a strong voice. And we had the hardliners and the more reasonable, or the softies. And then there was the IMF and the ECB. And remember, the ECB, I mean, all these institutions also evolved over time, and their attitudes evolved over time. In the first program, the ECB did not want to hear the word reprofiling because they were worrying about their independence. The individual countries were trying to really save the last penny because they had to face their own parliaments and they didn't want to spend a lot of money. So politics was always there. And in 2014, when I was a minister, I felt the IMF had changed attitude. In 2012, I perceived the IMF as more reasonable, that it knew about countries in crisis, that it was looking over the longer term. And I saw an IMF in the fall of 2014 acting more politically, essentially trying to forecasting that a leftist government would come to power early in 2015, and therefore unwilling to close the review, and coming with strange notions about the fiscal gap, and forcing me to actually invent things like conditional restrictions if in the first half of the year things do not turn out as we expect, etc., etc. So, I mean, Paul, and remember, when we got the extension in December of 2014, and actually during that time, I remember very well Mr. Moscovici coming out and saying, Greece has done the most among all program countries for its program, yet the program did not close. And then we had to ask for an extension. And during that extension, we wanted 3 months, and we only got 2 months. Why did we get 2 months? Because the 3 months would coincide with the Finnish elections, and the Finnish government was worried about the true Finns. So a lot of politics. Politics was always there. Remember, we always followed what the German parliament would do. We'd always follow what other parliaments would do. But Europe learns, from this experience. We paid the price as the Greeks, and we have banking union now in Europe. Now with the COVID crisis, we may have a closer fiscal union. You never know. So Europe does learn from these crises.
I wanted to ask. Sorry, yes.
One item, though, I should say, is that the collateral damage of the Greek crisis was its banking sector. I mean, the banking sector was not responsible for the crisis. It was the government, it was the fiscal, and it was the lack of competitiveness, the deeper cause. And the banking sector ended up paying the price. And another item we have to remember when we think about the Greek crisis, that this is not one crisis. It's not a monolithic crisis. It's two different crises in the package of one. The first crisis ended in 2014. It was due to economics. It was due to the twin deficits, to the lack of competitiveness, to all the wrong things perhaps politicians had done in the past. But by 2014, we had turned the page. Growth had come back. Money was coming in. The banks were recapitalized only with private funds. They passed the AQR stress test in October. Everything was turning positive, and we were predicting growth. And then a second crisis started in 2015, which was due to politics. Okay, so it's not only European politics that matter, it's Greek internal politics. The population never really understood what was going on during these years. Populists took over, it's my feeling, and somehow we were led, after the first crisis was over and we were about to take off, we were led to a new politically driven, a new recession, and we had a postponement of 2 or 3 years of the exit, so to speak. And we lost a lot of output, unemployment kept staying high, etc., etc. I mean, we had big missed opportunities.
Can I make a comment on that, a very quick one?
Yeah.
Politics will always trump economics. I think it's silly to think as economists that economic decision making is going to be dominant. Politics will always be the dominant force. And I want to pick up the last point that made. Let me finish my phrase. It's true that the internal politics were important in Greece as well, because we talk a lot about Europe mandated a particular type of bailouts. However, our politics was not problematic as of 2015 onwards only. It was also problematic from 2010, because in 2010, there was one party that shouldered the whole adjustment process, and the main opposition, the Conservative Party that had actually brought the deficit to where it was pretending that there were magical solutions and unicorns. So our politics, our political problems do not start with Syriza in 2015. They start much earlier, and this has yet to be recognized, unfortunately.
I just want to make a small comment to George, is that this is the typical question I used to ask politicians all along my professional life. Do you think economics drives politics, or do politics drive economics? And as an economist, of course, I always think it's economics that matters, but obviously George is more of a politician than I am. Anyway, they both feed on each other, and I agree. It's very hard to separate. Okay, but I tend to think that economics is number one anyway.
Okay. I want to ask Mr. Almounia, based on what Mr. Χαρδούβελη said about his experience about strange notions from the IMF and unrealistic expectations, it feels like at some point there was institutions and politicians that were taking place in this negotiation process of Greece. They had interpersonal relations, and this would actually affect the decision making. Did you feel during your research that actually interpersonal relations were playing a significant role to the decisions that would actually, have impact to 10 million Greeks?
Well, of course, personal relations in politics are extremely important. I cannot understand politics without personal relations, with personal dialogues, understandings, or tensions. So, indeed, for instance, in the IMF, I remember well the IMF in the period where the managing director was Dominique Strauss-Kahn. He changed completely the messages coming from Washington, from the IMF. But when the missions landed in Athens, not all the IMF officials spoke the same language than Dominique Strauss-Kahn or afterwards Christine Lagarde. The persons are relevant. For everybody who was involved in the Greek developments during those years, a person such as Paul Thompson has a personal footprint in the dialogues, in the positions, not always represented 100% what the IMF thought. The same in the case of the ECB. The personality from 2011 onwards of Mario Draghi changed many things in the monetary policy of the ECB, but some officials of the ECB were extremely tough, not always playing the same music than the Mario Draghi's words. And it's the same in the national politics, and of course was the same in Greece. The first 6 months of the Syriza government, the beginning of 2015, that Ggika referred to, were not the same than the next months and years once Varoufakis disappeared from the government. So it's very important. And in politics, it's extremely relevant, according to all my experience for years and years, to try to understand what are the arguments, the reasons, and the problems of the guys who are sitting at the other side of the table. And I think at the beginning, both in the relations between the EU and Greek authorities, and within Greece, in the relations from the government and the opposition, were not able to understand each other. And this makes it very difficult to do the right things and to develop and implement the right programs.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask Mr. Papakostandinu, maybe a point that you raised at the beginning, saying that the first program was not well designed, but also the second and the third program were not fully correct. And I want to ask if you have an understanding why, after the first time they didn't know, European institutions were unprepared, but the second and third time, why these programs were not well designed? What is your take?
If you don't mind, I also want to react to what Joaquin just said, because I slightly disagree with him. Not completely, but slightly disagree. I think personalities are important, and you build a trust with your interlocutors. When we first met with Joaquin, I think the difficult relationship we had reflected a little bit the distrust with the predecessors. Then trust was built. Then the Greek government changed, and it took some time for the trust to be reestablished. When the New Democracy government came to govern, part of the difficulty it had was that there was distrust because the new Prime Minister, Samaras, had a anti-memorandum rhetoric throughout the years. So, yes, the personal relationships do play a role. However, often Greek politicians think that they can give political solutions when there are underlying fundamentals and institutional mechanics that take precedence. Often in the first and the second and the third memorandum, people thought, I'm going to go there and have a political argument and convince them. Well, if the numbers don't follow, you cannot have a political argument and convince people with that. So I think it's important to and that's a slight differentiation to what Joaquin said. Now, coming to your question about the second and the third program, I think that programs evolved over time, reflecting the political realities and the lessons learned. For example, the second program was much more specific in terms of structural reforms, because the institutions felt that the structural reforms, when they were very summarily put into the first program, they would simply not implement it. So they said, okay, fine, then we're going to specify exactly what we want done. At the same time, the second program recognized that, for example, the first program did not have enough of product market reforms, and it recognized that. So the programs evolve according to how the teams that are in place see the reality, see the problems. Now, you cannot expect a revolution from one program to the other. I mean, the second program recognized and incorporated what the first program was lacking, which was the debt restructuring. But when the first program was designed, debt restructuring was not possible to come in. It was just impossible. The second program, after time had passed, after Greece had done a huge effort in reducing the fiscal deficit, then we could bring in the debt restructuring exercise. Now, the third program is to my mind, a completely different animal, because it was an emergency program that came about because of the 6 months of the disastrous negotiation that Syriza did in the beginning of 2015. It was a program that was unnecessary, and it was a program that was much worse than where we were before the elections were called, and much worse than the negotiating terms before Syriza decided to go to a referendum.
Mm-hmm. I would like to ask all of you, actually, if you believe that the two programs if they did achieve their goal, and looking back, could they have been more effective and less painful for the Greek people? I mean, maybe the fiscal part was a success, but did the reforms that were actually needed in the Greek economy happen?
Okay.
Mr. Almunda or Mr. Hardoubeli.
If you want,
Okay.
I can start. I can start.
Yes.
What we found during the evaluation of the second and the third programs, the macroeconomic imbalances were corrected indeed. The conditionality was too long, too many conditions. It was impossible to fulfill all the conditions in the short period of 3 years, apart the political constraints on this. Some important reforms were successful. For instance, according to the information I collected, the reform of the tax administration was good. Some reforms, for instance, the existence of a cadastre was finally put in place thanks to the program. Some reforms in the financial sector, in the banking sector, some reforms from the social point of view in the third program were decisions that had not been implemented in the previous ones, but could be implemented in the third program. But there is still a lot of work in progress. Not all the fundamental reforms that requires an economy such as the Greek one could be implemented and will need to be implemented in the coming years without troikas, without new programs, and with much more political agreements within Greece and with much more ownership, not only from the point of view of authorities, but from the point of view of the social partners and from the civil society in Greece. I compare sometimes the situation of the Greek economy right now with the Spanish one. We had only a program for the banking sector, for the cajas, the savings banks, and all this, but we need a lot of reforms in Spain. The same, not the same reforms, but the same long list of things to be done for our economy and for our sustainability as a country. And this will need a lot of work over years and a lot of ownership and political agreements from the point of view of the political parties supporting the government and from the point of view also of the opposition parties. And even if there is a political change, that those in opposition will become government and the opposite, they will need to maintain agreements, if not some of the relevant reforms that will make our economies and our societies really sustainable and fair from the social point of view will not be completed. And we can repeat, I don't know if the same kind of crisis than the one in 2010, but we will suffer more crises in the future, indeed. And we don't want, and we cannot afford to suffer more crises in this century. I hope we can avoid it.
Mr. Almounia, I think you described something very utopical. I wanted to ask Mr. Hardoubeli if it is possible actually to have this, to do reforms while the sun is shining, or you always need to be in a crisis to do such hard reforms that will help an economy, and how easy it is to have this consensus, the political consensus that Mr. Almounia was talking about.
Well, yeah. To answer your question, it's you need for reforms to stay, and by the way, you always have to reform. The economy and the society does not stay still; it keeps evolving. So you always need to be in a reform mode, and reforms are painful. They hit some oligopolistic groups who have voice, and their effect are not their influence and their positive effects are not felt at the moment, but they're visible in the longer run. So politicians tend to avoid reforms. One thing that we could have done and we did not do is the proper sequencing of reforms. When the IMF came in, it was used to simply go to countries, make the debt sustainable, do a big haircut, and then reform the labor market. They couldn't really impose a debt haircut because of the European politics at the time, but they did insist on the labor reforms first, which to me, it was a big mistake, and it caused a bigger recession than otherwise we would have seen. Had we tried the more difficult product and service markets reforms, which are more difficult because there are many, because you touch many sectors of the economy. It could be 100 different things to do. You have to work harder. But if you had done that, perhaps prices would be more flexible. Then you could go ahead and adjust wages, but real wages wouldn't have to fall as much. Therefore, you wouldn't have seen the huge recession you saw. Instead, the choice was the easy way out: do labor reforms. The labor reforms cut across all sectors. And I remember during the Papadimos time, they were even pushing us to reduce the wages in the to impose law about wages in the private sector, which the government couldn't do. So and reform. From my experience as a minister, I felt that I spent a lot of my time trying to stop politicians from undoing the reforms they themselves had signed earlier on, because elections were coming. So ownership is the key there.
Ownership is definitely the key. It's a very important issue that you raised, Mr. Χαρδούβελη. I just want a very quick round from all of you with a question: is have the lessons? Did Europe learn its lessons? Are we more prepared for a new crisis if it happens in the future? And what's the greatest lesson we learned, Mr. Almounia?
Well, half and half. So, for instance, completing the architecture and the institutional toolbox of the Economic and Monetary Union has not yet been completed. During the previous crisis, during the financial crisis, there were the 4 presidents' report, the 5 presidents' report, another paper, another communication. There are still things that has not been adopted, and we are now in the new crisis. From the point of view of the financial sector, some very good responses were adopted at the EU level, but we will now be obliged to face new challenges because the present monetary policy will not be there forever, and the consequences of the pandemic crisis in terms of non-performing loans and impairments in the balance sheets of the banks will require new reactions. And without this, the real economy will not work and will not grow, will not create good jobs. So these are lessons that were learned to some percentage in the previous crisis, but will need to be learned again with new circumstances, with new politicians, with ministers and heads of state and government that were not present in the previous crisis. So maybe they will learn quicker, but let's see if they learn what is needed.
Mr. Papakostandinu, do you agree? Have we learned our lessons, or we need to learn them again with new leaders, as Mr. Almounia says?
Well, the problem is that crises never repeat themselves in exactly the same way. So even if you've learned the questions, you have a new crisis with different characteristics, so you have to adapt to that. So yes, we learned many important lessons during the crisis. Let's not repeat them, because I think we discussed a lot of them. But has this allowed us to deal better with current crisis? Well, partly yes. We can see how the policy response to this crisis has been much better, much faster, much more robust, more correct instruments, more solidarity. But by no means is the job done. And I think the same holds for our own country, right? It's not just Europe. It's also that we have not fully learned the lessons of this crisis. To me, it is incredible, for example, that we still have the prosecution of Andreas Georgiou, which means that we have not understood that, in fact, there was fiscal derailment and fiscal fraud. And instead, we're prosecuting the person who actually came up and said the real figures. This means that there's something deeper in the Greek political system which refuses to acknowledge the true elements of the crisis in the first place. And if you don't come clean with what caused the crisis, you're going to repeat a lot of the same mistakes next time around.
Mr. Χαρδούβελης, we have less than a minute. If you can give us your last comment and the lessons learned.
All I can say, I see the cup half full, not half empty. I think Europe is learning from every crisis. And I'll tell you a story. When I was in the US, I used to see my colleagues, economic historians, who used to say the Eurozone will never happen. So I came to Europe and I realized politics matters. George, I agree with you there. And Eurozone took place. I would go back to these history conferences and the same people would say Eurozone will be dissolved in 5 years. Well, Eurozone is here and it's getting stronger. Yes, we don't have deposit insurance, but we do have we have the ESM, we have SSM, we have the banks are following proper governance, even in Greece. We're thinking about ESG all over Europe and in Greece. And I think we're becoming better over time through the pain of the crisis in a difficult way, but we do learn.
Okay, on that positive note, I think it's time to say goodbye to our esteemed guests. Thank you very much, Mr. Almounia, Mr. Papakostandinu, and Mr. Χαρδούβελης. It has been a pleasure talking to you. I hope for everyone who has watched us today, have a lovely evening, and hoping that this positive note is going to be the reality of the Eurozone as well.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.